Hello, genetics students. Welcome to Chapter 1. I'm going to be breaking these chapters up into a couple of different recordings. I am doing these recordings at home, so from time to time you may hear my kids come running through. You might hear some Minecraft music, dogs barking. It's a very busy place in the Albano household. Anyways, let's get going with Chapter 1. So what you should be seeing on your screen is a PDF that you should be able to also pull up and flip through individual slides. So as we get going, let's first talk about what is genetics. Genetics is the field of science that studies the variation of traits in individuals and also studies heredity, how those traits are passed from parents to offspring. We do call this a unifying discipline in biology because this is a discipline that also helps explains evolution. Evolution is also the unifying theory of biology, but we'll get to that another time. What we're really going to be looking at here in this class is how organisms have traits and how those traits are passed from the parents to the offspring. And it's all centered on these individual units within DNA called genes. And genes have all kinds of unique little recipes that give us all our different characteristics. So we'll get into that in a lot more detail in the next few chapters. So let's first deal with what traits are. These terms, when you look at them in the PowerPoints, if there are like headers here, like morphological traits, odds are that might be a question that shows up on the exam. So that's the type of thing to start paying attention to as you go through. You may want to grab a highlighter and highlight morphological traits for yourself to know to go back to that and study it for the exam. Now, morphological trait is something that has an effect on the appearance of the organism, like the example that we have here, flower color. It also would be things like the position of a flower on a plant. Now, physiological traits, these are a little bit difficult to look at because you're looking at usually the biochemistry of an organism, how the organism functions. And these physiological traits can be very difficult to hammer down with individual genes. So those are things that you'll generally see as metabolic pathways, like the ability to digest sucrose, which is table sugar. And then we have even more difficult behavioral traits. This is the way an organism responds to its environment. Behavioral traits are things that might be inborn, and some of these might be things that are learned. So, for example, mating calls within a bird species. These are behavioral traits. However, to some degree, birds learn to sing their songs from their fathers, or male birds do. And so these behavioral traits also have a heavy environmental influence on them. So for this class, what we're mostly going to be paying attention to are the genetic or the DNA influence on these more complex behavioral traits. So basically, what's going to be affecting the traits of an organism? The molecules for sure, okay? The molecules that are in the organism cells, but the environment shapes how those molecules react sometimes in the organism itself. And so living cells we have to think about now as a group of biomolecules. So what are biomolecules? These are molecules that are basically organic molecules. They all have carbon in them. And so if you've taken organic chemistry, you've probably already had some experience with looking at different organic molecules. But as a rule, they're all going to be carbon-based molecules. And these are the molecules that build an organism. These molecules are linked together through chemical bonds, and the different types of molecules are going to have different name links or linkage names. So let's start with the four main large molecules that we're going to be talking about in this class. They are the nucleic acids. The nucleic acids are going to be DNA and RNA. Proteins. Proteins are interesting because when we think of protein, a lot of people say chicken or eggs. Really what we mean in terms of proteins are going to be chains of amino acids. And then you have carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are sugars. Sugars can be very simple sugars, like things like glucose, that is used by every cell of living organisms, or it could be as complex as starch. Complex carbohydrates are things that, let's say, dietarily give you energy for long periods of time, like oatmeal. Simple carbohydrates, like sucrose, table sugar, are things that give you a quick burst of energy, but then you kind of drop off. You get a sugar crash. So carbohydrates are essential for metabolism in organisms. And then you have lipids. Lipids are fats, and whether or not we like to think about fat, fat is a very important molecule for organisms to have in their cells. The cell membranes are made exclusively, the outsides, just the membrane alone, is made of fat called phospholipids, and we'll be getting to that a little bit later. So nucleic acids, proteins, and carbohydrates are all called macromolecules. Macro meaning large, and molecules for molecules. You can also call them polymers. Poly for many, and then mers for repeating units. And so basically polymer means many repeating units of small molecules, usually called monomers, mono for single, mers for, single unit. And when you link these things together, you get long chains, okay? And those would be your proteins, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, and to some degree also fatty acids, but we'll get to that later. Cell structures are definitely the interactions among molecules and macromolecules. So sometimes you're going to be dealing with little molecules, sometimes really big ones. So the way a cell works depends on the type of macromolecules that it has, and very specifically the types of proteins that a cell makes. These proteins, as it says here, are the workhorses of a cell. What do we mean by a workhorse? What we mean is that proteins do many different jobs in a cell. Again, when we talk about proteins, a lot of people think, oh, chicken, eggs, protein powder. You think of actin and myosin, you think of muscle, because chicken, when you're eating beef, that's the muscle of the animal. And so the protein that you're dealing with there is actin, myosin, and some other associated proteins. When we talk about proteins being the workhorses of the cell, really what we're talking about are proteins that have diverse biological functions. Many of these proteins actually allow the cell to make new proteins. They allow the cell to communicate with the external environment of the cell. So I want you to start thinking of proteins as being much more diverse and having more jobs to do than just something you eat. Proteins are chains of amino acids that do different jobs. One of the most important groups of proteins are called enzymes. Enzymes are also termed biological catalysts. Now, if you think back to chemistry, when you took chemistry in high school or if you took a college-level chemistry class, a catalyst is a molecule that causes a change in another molecule. And so a biological enzyme or catalyst allows things to be either sliced apart. So you start with a large protein and you digest it chemically using an enzyme to make little proteins. Or you can actually put little proteins together to make larger proteins. And so we're going to be thinking of catabolic enzymes, which break down. So catabolic, break down large molecules. That would be digestion. When we break down molecules in digestion, that gives cells energy to do things. And we can get to that later and talk about energy metabolism later. Anabolic enzymes build things. So think about it as anabolic, like anabolic steroids, frankly, that make you bigger muscles. Anabolic enzymes help you synthesize or make large molecules from smaller ones. So they're kind of gluing things together. So catabolic, the way I remembered it when I was in undergrad, was cats rip things up. And don't be offended, I have a cat too, but she does rip things up, okay, in my defense. Anabolic builds things, okay? So cats rip things down, Anna builds them back up again. So where do we get all of these enzymes from? The recipe for making anabolic and catabolic enzymes in every organism are held in DNA. The genetic material of almost all living organisms is deoxyribonucleic acid. So this is for the deoxyribonucleic, N is for nucleic, and then A for acid. So DNA codes for everything that a cell needs to survive. And it has a very unique structure, which we're going to get into later. And DNA, without its presence in a cell will not be able to live very long. There are some exceptions. For example, human red blood cells do not have a nucleus. Therefore, they do not have their own DNA inside of them. As a consequence, red blood cells really can't make new enzymes. They can't do new things very easily. But what are they really meant to do? Carry oxygen around the body. Their job's very important, but really their they don't have as much stress or pressure on them as maybe other cells like a muscle cell or a pancreatic cell or cell in the liver. All right, so at the end of 10 slides, the end of this 10th slide, I'm going to start a new recording for this chapter. I don't want these recordings to be too long because, this way you'll be able to take a break, move on to the next bit. For our last slide, DNA is a polymer of nucleotides. Remember polymer, poly for many, mer for repeating, many repeating units. And these nucleotides are made up of nitrogen, oxygen, phosphates, and they are designated in terms of the nitrogenous bases associated with the rest of the nucleotide shape. That would be adenine, or A, thymine, or T, cytosine, C, or guanine, G. All of our genes only use those 4 letters or those 4 nucleotides as a recipe. And that genetic information is usually stored in what we call a eukaryotic cell in the nucleus. In bacteria, DNA is stored in the cytoplasmic space, but we'll get to that later. And basically, DNA is a long molecule that can be broken down into individual segments or genes. This information is what allows cells to produce proteins. We're going to look at how that happens later on in the semester. I'm going to stop now and start a new recording, so please hang in there. See you in a couple minutes.